Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dr. Heidi Cramm, and her talk is Garnet Families, Serving Alongside for Our Safety and Security.
Families. As a researcher, it's a fascinating, challenging topic. And it's one of these interesting things because everybody has some experience with families. Everyone is connected through family of origin or through their own construction around families. So families can look a lot of different ways. Families can be that family of origin. They can also be a chosen family. They can be an adoptive family. You can have in your family parents or siblings, partners, spouses, no partners, no spouses, children, no children, pets. You can have a family constructed of blended relations, step relations, even separated relations. So the ways in which families can look, it's a long list. But despite how we have that variety, when we think about what do families mean to people, that's where we really get into some big differences because families can mean a lot of different things to different people. We're socialized to think about what families look like and what families are expected to do as part of our critical societal institution. And a lot of those ideas that we have actually come from pretty traditional notions of gender distribution of labor within families, and also these kind of widespread assumptions about what families are able to offer in terms of adaptive supports, infinite capacity to provide support, or at least families are imagined as having that capacity. Policy looks at families in a pretty narrow way, generally looking at families as the source of reproduction, where babies come from, and where children are raised, and also families are looked to and relied upon within our society as caregivers. All of these things might feel familiar, but there's nothing straightforward about families or families research. And when we think about families, families are more than a collection of individuals. Families actually are systems. They're complex systems that evolve over time. And when we think about things as a system, what happens to one member of the family reverberates out into the rest of that family system and vice versa. So there's this kind of bidirectional reverberation. And for certain occupations, that reverberation is louder and heavier than it is for other occupations. In these kinds of families, those occupations really have a lot of influence on the routines and the rhythms of the families, how labor is distributed within those families. And these families, we actually have a tacit reliance on these families to do more, to step up, and to take that extra load, because we need people in these kinds of occupations to actually enact those roles in the community. We depend on these people to actually do these roles. Now, some of you here are healthcare providers, and these are going to feel familiar to you, these demands, where you have urgent, non-standard work hours that you have to come in and meet the demands of the community. Absolutely. But today we're going to talk more and explore those occupational layers and how they play out for the families, for military, for first responder, and for other public safety personnel, or PSP. Why these families? Why now? Well, we actually have quite a situation happening in Canada around retention and recruitment across these sectors. For some of these sectors, they're really experiencing crisis levels of challenge here. And there is a societal, economic imperative for us to have a healthy workforce, an efficient and effective workforce for those occupations that are dedicated to our collective safety and security. So when we know that there is this reverberation, this bidirectional reverberation that is heavy in these families, we have to pay attention to that. We have to recognize and respond to the needs and experiences of these families. My name is Heidi Cramm, and I'm an occupational therapist. I'm also a professor in the School of Rehabilitation Therapy, and I lead the Families Matter research group. And for me, this is actually personal because I'm married to a public safety personnel. I've been a longtime spouse of a career firefighter. I'm wearing my long service pin that I got last year when he got his long service medal. So the companions receive their pin. And so you think 28 years on the job, we've learned a few things. So for me, it's personal, but I didn't wake up thinking, oh yeah, I'm totally going to, do a program of research on families like mine. In fact, I didn't know that it was going to be an area of research at all. It kind of came by degrees. And it started many years ago when I was working clinically. And in my clinical work, I was working in child and adolescent psychiatry here in Kingston. And in Kingston, it's a military town. So, there are military families here, but the visibility and the number of military families isn't present for most of us in our day-to-day. But working in child psychiatry, their presence was quite large. And I really didn't have any way to understand that. And there was no research there for me to be able to really understand back in 2000 what was going on for military families, why the military family lifestyle might create additional stressors that might have impacts for kids with kids and their mental health. So then, after I did my research training and took up a faculty position here at Queen's, I had the opportunity to focus my program of research on family mental health and well-being. So I started looking at military family mental health and well-being and started to understand what's going on with these families, like how do we understand the stressors? And what I found was some of those lifestyle stressors were echoed in public safety families, families like mine. And so I started to look for, well, what's out there for and about families like mine? And I found pretty much nothing. So with the Families Matter research group, we've really been working to change that. So what have we been seeing in terms of the research? Well, we've done dozens of studies now to help us understand what goes on with and for and about these families. And what we found is that they're carrying a heavier load, but that's not really enough to figure out what do you do about that? And so through all of the studies, we've pulled the information together, and over the past few years, I've really been leading this development of a new conceptual framework around the occupational lifestyle dimensions for families. And this has been really helpful because it gives us an anchor. It gives us a place to start. It gives us a place to test against, to see, like, what do we know about this? What do we know about that? How are we doing? And so what we've been able to see in being able to see that there are these lifestyle dimensions is that there's actually 4 that come together in this layered, potentiating, synergistic way. So I want to take you through each of them one at a time, and you're going to relate to them in your own world, in your own family. You will relate to some elements of these for sure. But I want you to think about, as we start to stack them, how they connect and how they come together for military and public safety families. So the first dimension is logistics. And people get logistics. How do you balance work and home, right? This can get more complicated, less complicated, depending on what's going on with different jobs. Most Canadian families, if there's 2 adults in the family, they're both working. So there's some natural conflict that happens there in balancing it all. If you have a job that is very demanding for the health or the safety or security of Canadians, then you're going to get pulled into doing that job. And you may not have a say over what your shifts are and when you have to show up and how long you have to be there. And if you can imagine what kinds of complications that can create if you're expecting someone to get off work at a certain time and they are not released from their duties and they have to stay. And what that does in terms of the family routine and the rhythm, things like the spouse's career, things like childcare. Those things can happen every day differently, and they're dynamic. And this is the really interesting thing, is that all of these demands change. And for families like mine, and maybe some of yours who are working in jobs where there's a 24/7 requirement, is that that 24/7 requirement changes the intensity of that logistics dimension. So when we think about, working from home during the lockdowns with COVID, that was complicated. Doing homeschooling with kids, or Zoom schooling with kids, complicated logistics. So then layer into that someone like my husband who's been out in the community working for 24 hours and then who has to come home and obviously needs to sleep. And we all have to be quiet and still manage all the logistical demands of home and school and work. So that's an example of that intensification of that dimension. The next one is mobility. Now, mobility can play out in different ways for different sectors. For fire, as a municipal job, there's no mobility. If I didn't get the job here at Queen's, we would be living in separate communities. So thankfully, that worked out. So here we are. But for other sectors, mobility is a requirement. It's part of what people know they're going to have to do. And this we see in some police forces for sure, but we definitely see it for military families. Military families move 2 to 3 times more often than the average Canadian. So the consequences of all that mobility really start to add up when you think about things like the trailing spouse's career trajectory, the children's educational pathway, especially if there's a child who has special needs, access to actual any, primary care, forget specialized care, primary care for military spouses and dependents. These things take a cumulative kind of effect. And if you think of the intensification of that over the past number of years, where the cost of housing has been absolutely ludicrous. And if you don't have choice over when you move, where you move, or how long you get to stay there, imagine the consequences financially that you're going to carry as a family. So military families have been dealing with that. The third dimension is identity. So these identities, there's a complex negotiation of identities. For some sectors, it's positive. For some, not so much. For military families, it can be very protective when people see themselves as belonging to something that has a greater purpose, and they are participating in a shared mission. This can be protective. For public safety personnel, for fire in particular, where I'm familiar, people like to see firefighters coming, generally. Right? They're like, yay, the firefighters are here. And firefighters are bringing order to chaos, right? People feel relief, comfort when firefighters show up. Is the same true for police? The sentiment around police, about police, can be fraught with apprehension, hostility, and fear. And there's a social conference of those expectations onto their families. So how do you negotiate that with the broader community? As a police officer, police families, they're in it to serve, there's high risk, and the community maybe doesn't appreciate or recognize that, or provide them that kind of social thank you back for the service that they are providing and the risk that they're taking. A child in kindergarten might be like, my mom or dad is a police officer and so proud to share that. A child in grade 7 might be very reluctant to do so. They might fear that they're going to be bullied and have hostility directed towards them. The last dimension I think we can all appreciate is risk. When folks in these jobs go to work, they have real risk of injury, illness, and even death. When we think about the news over the past year of these military and public safety officers, what have we heard? We all followed the wildfires. We looked at those volunteer firefighters primarily at the interface of our communities fighting raging wildfires. We heard about their deaths in the West Coast, in particular this year. We hear about occupational cancers. We hear about suicides. We hear about the killing of police officers far too often. These risks are quite real, and they sit heavy with families every time their loved one goes to work. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how things are going to go. We don't know the nature of the calls they're going to get pulled into. We sit with that every time they go to work. When we think about global events and the amount of insecurity there is in the world, and we see where is our military, most Canadians don't even know that the military is currently deployed. So how do we support these families when the risks that they carry sits heavy? So we have these 4 things that come together, right? We've got these dimensions, we've got logistics, we have identities, we've got mobility, and we have risk. Each on their own is difficult, and you might relate to any one of those yourself. Put them all together, and they have this synergistic effect, very layered, very challenging. And so this is why we have been spending time trying to better understand and support these kinds of families. And when we talk about these kinds of families, what we're calling them is Garnet families. Now you might be like, why Garnet families? How did you get there? And yes, it was a complicated process. And for a myriad of reasons, I could do an entire talk just on the naming, truly. But if you think about those 4 dimensions, there is no word in the English language that captures the constellation of those 4 things. There's nothing that captures the complexity of that phenomenon. And what we have with all of those dimensions, that every family individually experiences those dimensions, but it's a shared phenomenon. So how do we give visibility, shape, elevate awareness around that shared phenomenon? This is how we came to say, we need a new concept that we can actually create some sort of umbrella here and consolidate this shared experience together with that visibility so that we can actually anchor the work there. And that's how we came to find garnet as a symbol. Now you're like, why garnet? Well, garnets are gemstones. Most commonly, if you're January, you might know this is your birthstone. But for the rest of us, it is this red, sanguine kind of pomegranate color. That's the most common one, like the one I'm wearing. And garnets are and have been symbols throughout the ages of love, loyalty, healing, protection, and what we thought was most apt, the safe return to family. So with that, we've created the Garnet Families Network, a community, a place where we can connect Garnet families and those who study, serve, and support them. Because what we've learned by consolidating the work, rather than having 17 public safety occupations and everybody doing everything incrementally, or us studying things across Air Force and Navy and Army and saying, well, they're all different. But yes, they're all different. But what's the same is this unifying phenomenon of these 4 occupational dimensions, the Garnet experience. And so we can, and we've seen in the past 18 months, 2 years, just how much farther and faster we can go together. And this occupational lifestyle dimension really changes the conversation for us because it lets us see quickly what's missing for a given sector. How do we respond to that as a research community? What's available that we could adapt to a sector? Let's do that rather than start from scratch. So that's been a wonderful thing. We've also, through significant investment from the Public Health Agency of Canada and with our partners at the University of Regina and our international colleagues, we've been able to create the first international resource for public safety families. So it's an online wellbeing hub called PSPNet Families, and it really allows us to go upstream and understand all those kind of daily grind things that's getting at these families. So the logistics and the identities, how do we give people the information and the knowledge about what it's like to be on the job so they can better figure out how to manage it, not 10 years in or 20 years in, but from the get-go. And how do we provide people with that? We've also, in that Wellbeing Hub, we offer a spouse and significant other Internet Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Wellbeing course. So for folks who are struggling with their anxiety, with their depression, as spouses, the worry, how to give them the skills that they need. So this really is this upstream prevention, primary, secondary prevention wellbeing hub, and the feedback has been resoundingly positive. Users are like, I feel seen, you get my experience, I don't have to explain it to people, it's tailored, it responds to the occupational, cultural differences that these communities experience. And even though we launched just last December, we have over 20,000 unique users of our site. So the the response has been really positive. So when we think about Garnet families, a couple of things for you to take away. The first is, we've really tried to move beyond this idea of the serving personnel and their families. For years, I've joked about, I could be in meetings with like a placard and go, and families, and just remind people like, hey, families are here too. Because we now understand that there is this bidirectional reverberation that matters to retention and recruitment, these things, it's more taken for granted that, yes, families do matter, families themselves matter in these occupational worlds in their own right, not just in service of the organization or the person who's serving. And there's this old adage that about the military. So if the military wanted you to have a family, they would have issued you one. So we hope that we're past that. Families are now in defense policy at a federal level. But when we think about Garnet families and we think about families as systems, one of the important things here that changes the conversation for us going forward is that we're pulling the serving member back into their families. Rather than having the serving member and their families who talk about families, they're members of their own families. And we have different opportunities to understand how to keep families well when we look at them as systems. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about representation. Who are we talking about when we talk about families? Who sees themselves in the program and the policy? Policy is narrow. So when we look at the Five Eyes military alliance countries, so that's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and the United Kingdom, and we look at, who's the programs there for what kind of military families, invariably, you still are seeing the men in uniform serving, married to women, 2.3 children, and a dog. That's generally, we kind of joke about it, wow, it doesn't matter what country you're in, it's still the same thing. The one thing that changes is the breed of the dog, right? And I think that, we are looking for more in our diversity than that, and a diversity in human representation and also across the life course. We need to provide for families beyond that early reproductive years where it's young families with young children. Families and their life course. Families like mine, who, we've got empty nester, though, maybe not so empty all the time. So if you think about that representation, it really does matter. So we need to continue to diversify that representation. Because if we're really going to recruit and retain that is representative of our communities, we need to be responsive to those very real issues. The third takeaway is that this is a collective responsibility. Paying attention and responding, recognizing responding to the challenges and the load that these families carry affects all of us and our collective safety and security. It is more likely to contribute to a healthy workforce for these occupations that are committed to safety and security. So certainly in our Families Matter research group, most of us are Garnet families ourselves, which has really influenced the work. And we do see the research as a form of service to these communities. So I would like to thank my own Garnet family, all the Garnet families in our group, and all the Garnet families out there doing it every day. You may recognize in yourself, hey, I'm a Garnet family, or I know someone who's a Garnet family, but I never appreciated the complexity of what they carry. Help us connect to one another and help us raise this awareness and this collective call to action.